Truman. Keep in mind that up to this point, Truman was the president of the United States because he had been the vice president and then FDR had died. And so he had taken over the presidency. But then he's going to actually campaign for a full term in his own right in the election of 1948. And he's actually going to face some unexpected luck in this campaign, because what we're going to see is we're going to have the Republican Party versus the Democrats with Truman, but also you get a lot of new fringe parties on the far right and the far left, which actually ends up helping Truman because he really looks like the moderate center. Now, he is going to enter this race as an underdog, but he's soon going to end up looking like the best option for a steady course. So looking at all of his opponents, we can break it down to these other parties. So we're going to have the American Progressive Party is going to put forward Henry Wallace. Then we have the very left-leaning Dixiecrats, though officially their name was the States' Rights Democrats. They're going to put forward Governor Strom Thurmond of South Carolina. And then, of course, you have your Republicans putting forward Thomas Dewey. Remember, Thomas Dewey was the one who had run against FDR back in 1944. And really, the Republicans are going to be the most serious competition for Truman in this particular election. So looking at these different individuals, if we look at Henry Wallace, he kind of cast himself as like a prophet for the century of like the common man. Basically, he's going to argue points like the United States was actually forcing the Cold War on the Soviet Union. And by focusing on the Cold War, this is really undermining American ideals because basically it's diverting attention away from issues at home, such as poverty and racism. However, Henry Wallace is also going to push for ideas like he wanted to just completely repeal the draft and destroy all atomic weapons. Now, there is something to be said that these kinds of arguments have some merit because we are seeing at this point in time America becoming a much more militarized society. And so we see that kind of coming out of World War II and everything. But most people did not like the idea of, just getting rid of the draft and getting rid of atomic weapons, especially when the atomic weapons had helped America win World War II. And now they're seemingly in this Cold War with the Soviet Union. And so a lot of people across America saw Henry Wallace more as like a kook than an actual statesman. Then we have the far left, which is the Dixiecrats, or the States' Rights Democrats with Governor Strom Thurmond. The thing is, in the 1948 Democratic National Convention, we have some Democrats walk out of the convention. And it basically came down to one issue: civil rights. Basically, the Democrats who refused to call for full civil rights for African Americans are going to revolt and form their own party, which is the Dixiecrats. Now, while some are going to call this revolt futile and narrow-minded, Strom Thurmond's going to claim, oh no, the Dixiecrats aren't just against, civil rights and stuff. They're trying to defend Americans against government bureaucracy, rather than, fighting to preserve racial segregation, which is also something that they were definitely doing. Basically, you can even see this. Very few are going to listen to Strom Thurmond outside of the deep South. So the real opponent against the Democrats in this was the Republicans Party, Thomas Dewey. The thing is, Dewey, though, lacked a common touch. He was smooth on the outside, and yet he would go on to alienate people who should have been his closest supporters. I read in one book, and this is a great description of him, he was a bit of a snot. So the thing is, Dewey is an arrogant campaigner. It's things like he refused to interrupt his morning schedule to talk to voters. But we're going to see Truman is basically going to outmaneuver him in this way. And I want you to kind of keep that in mind, that Dewey wouldn't even deviate from his morning schedule to meet with voters versus what you're going to see Truman doing. So Truman is going to do things like use confrontations with Congress to rally voters that had supported the New Deal. So he'd purposely introduce legislation knowing that it would be ignored. And then, like, Truman would use the veto, even though he knew that a Republican-controlled Congress is going to override it. And so he can make all of these issues campaign issues and basically demonstrate that, oh, the Republicans are here being obstructionists. Really, the election of 1948 is the last time a major candidate crosses the nation by rail and makes speeches from rear platforms of trains. So Truman is coming to the people. We do see, in this election, the national television broadcast is going to have the two-party conventions televised, but it's basically talking heads. So it's nothing like you see in those conventions today and everything. And so Truman is going to run on both issues and on character. So he covers miles and miles via train on his campaign. It's something like he gives like 10 speeches a day, stops in all these little towns and cities that were belittled by the Republicans as being like so-called whistle stops. Like, oh, it's a whistle stop, and nobody actually like gets off there is the idea. And so in this way, Truman's bringing the campaign to the average American. When he would have these speeches, he would tie Dewey to issues like inflation, the housing shortage going on, just fear across America about what was the future of Social Security. And then Truman would hammer on the Republicans with the whole like Taft-Hartley Act, remember, keeping unions from being able to unionize and strike and everything, and pointing out that that's the Republicans' view. And so he would point out, whereas the Democrats had done things like build dams and turned natural resources into jobs, kind of pulling that whole New Deal element of pulling out of the Great Depression into it. And so in this way, basically Truman managed to characterize the Republican Party as the party of privilege, the party of arrogance. And the other thing that really actually helps Truman out is that Dewey just was unwilling to give a fight. Dewey's speeches instead would be packed with these platitudes. He'd say things like, "Our streams will abound with fish." Okay, how? Whereas Truman's looking at all of these different things. So in the end, as you saw on that map on the last slide, Wallace and Thurmond are going to have each under 1.2 million votes. Dewey is going to have 22 million votes and 189 of the Electoral College, and Truman will have 24 million votes and 303 of the Electoral College. So this is how Truman wins. Now, once Truman is back in office, he is going to call for a so-called fair deal for all Americans. So when we talk about the New Deal, that is very much something of FDR's. Truman, it is the fair deal. Basically, Truman wanted to extend the New Deal and cause economic prosperity and opportunity for people. And so because he's having to deal with, though, more like Republicans and Southern Democrats who don't necessarily agree with him, he's going to have to choose these kinds of measures very carefully. What this essentially means is that the fair deal is going to expand on existing programs, but there's going to be a rejection of any kind of departure from like the New Deal. So it's things like we get the Housing Act of 1949, where the federal government reaffirms this concern about families who have been priced out of the private market. And so it's going to provide like money for local housing agencies to buy, clear, and resell land for housing. But the idea behind it was clearing substandard areas and replacing it with affordable like modern apartments, but it doesn't really ever work as it was intended, basically because there wasn't enough money appropriated for it. And then unfortunately there were some really poor designs of replacement housing, and then locals would actually decide where this would happen, and they generally concentrated it in like segregated minority neighborhoods only. But at least it was establishing like a goal of decent housing for all. But the extension of the New Deal is going to be things like 1950, Congress is going to revitalize the weak Social Security program. Benefits go up by about 80% on average. We're going to see 10.5 million additional people now can receive things like old age insurance and like survivors insurance. This is going to be mostly more and more rural and small town people who hadn't been covered under the original Social Security Act. However, the Fair Deal is going to also have some proposals that are rejected, such as they are going to try to push for the Fair Employment Practices Commission, and this would have fought racial discrimination in hiring. So this was fighting for civil rights for African Americans, but it was rejected, and therefore that kind of halts a lot of progress to civil rights initially. We're also going to see blocked a proposal for a national health insurance program. So health insurance, not a new issue by any means. Basically, Americans viewed it as too socialistic. So the overall message, what we see out of Truman's Fair Deal, is basically Americans like the New Deal, but they're wary and hesitant about new measures. So, thinking about Truman's campaign, how can you compare and contrast Truman's campaign to that of a presidential candidate from 2008 to the president? You don't have to do a specific candidate, but just thinking about like more modern presidential campaigns, compare and contrast.